I asked him if he was ready to do anything to help Rochelle, because I knew at that point that he had feelings for her too.
And what was his response?
He said absolutely.
Okay. And then what?
And then we started to.
Well, did you tell him what you wanted him to do?
Well, yes.
Okay. And what was that?
I told him that Rochelle wanted her mother dead.
Okay. And so what was his response?
He said, "Okay, let's do it."
Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. I hope you're all doing super well. Thank you so much for being here. Today, we're going to be discussing the murder of 48-year-old Lauri Waterman, a well-known and loved member of the community in Craig, Alaska. What's even more disturbing about this case is that someone close to Lauri knew she was going to be murdered, yet did nothing to stop it. This is one of those cases where there's a lot of split opinion about who did this or if Lauri actually got justice. We are also going to be discussing grooming in this video, and I will be linking some resources down below on how parents can recognize the signs of grooming and how teens can become aware of older and just predatory people. It's just one of those cases where I felt like I kept getting deeper and deeper into the research. I was like, okay, I'm just gonna watch this one last interview, and then I would watch another one, and then I would watch like a whole testimony clip from a trial. Like, I just could not stop watching videos about this because it genuinely was just one of those cases where I was like, what the heck is going on, and how are people just so evil? I know I say this in like every single video, but you guys are truly the best familia ever. I appreciate you guys so much. Just the fact that you guys show up here every single week to watch my videos and help me spread awareness, it truly means the world to me. So thank you. But with that, let's jump right into today's video. Lauri Ann Martelli was born on April 16th, 1956 in Tacoma, Washington, to her parents Don and Merrill. She attended Curtis High School, graduated in 1964, and then a few years later in 1978, she married her husband Carl Waterman and moved to Craig, Alaska. Craig is the largest town on Prince of Wales Island and has beautiful scenery and wildlife. Although it is the largest town on the island, it is still like a very small-knit fishing village where basically everyone knows everyone. It's like kind of one of those towns in like a typical like teen drama show, or like one of those shows, you know, where it's all small town and like everyone's in each other's business and like your neighbors are like your best friends type of thing. That is exactly how this town was. Lauri and Carl had two children together, a boy named Jeffrey and a girl named Rochelle. Lauri was incredibly dedicated to her family and was an inspiration to others in the community for being just like a stellar mom. She was incredibly active in the community. She worked at an elementary school as a special education aide, and she also volunteered at the local Catholic church. She served on the board of the Little League and the town library board. She was involved in the PTA, and she was just always volunteering to help with potlucks or events or to chaperone her children's school events. She was just like a very involved person. I mean, anything surrounding her community or her family, she would participate in. Lauri wasn't the only one well known in her community though. Her husband Carl was also well liked. Carl was born in 1994 in Kellogg, Idaho, and from a young age, Carl was very hardworking, he was very intelligent, and because of this, that actually earned him the nickname Doc, which almost everyone called him. Like around the town, everyone would be like, hey Doc, like what's going on? He obviously wasn't a doctor, but that was just like the nickname everyone gave him. He went on to become a decorated veteran, and when he was in Alaska, he was the city administrator. He served on Craig's Planning and Zoning Committee. He served on the Prince of Wales Chamber of Commerce and the Alaska Girl Scout Advisory Council. He was also the president of the Craig School Board, and then on top of all of that, he eventually became a real estate broker full-time. I know, it's a lot. You know, just writing down everything that they were involved in was like overwhelming. I was like, wow, like these two people really loved their community. They really loved to be a part of their children's life. And you know, it just felt like Carl and Lauri were just like on a different level. To everyone, it just really seemed like Carl and Lauri were the ultimate power couple. They had a beautiful relationship, a loving family, they were active in their community. I mean, it all just seemed picture perfect. However, there were some rumors going around the community that Carl was having an affair. Not just one affair, but multiple affairs. The rumors stated that anytime he would travel for work, he would cheat on his wife. From what I read though, this was just small town gossip and nothing more. The reason that I mention these rumors is because they came to play when Lauri disappeared from the Waterman family home. Yes, Lauri went missing, and to police, a husband rumored to be having affairs could have plenty of reasons to get rid of his wife. On Sunday, November 14th, 2004, Carl and his daughter Rochelle returned home after a weekend away between 3 and 3:30 p.m. And as they were pulling up to the family's house, they noticed that Lauri's van was missing from the garage. Carl was in Juneau for the annual Girl Girl Scouts council meeting, and Rochelle was in Anchorage at a state volleyball tournament. Their son Jeffrey was away at college, so Lauri spent the weekend alone. After Carl and Rochelle didn't see Lauri's van in the garage, no red flags really went off in their minds. They were thinking that maybe Lauri went out to go get something from the store, or was just like running an errand, or something simple like that. They immediately didn't think, oh, something is wrong, like Lauri's in danger. So they noticed that the van is missing, but they decide to get inside the house, unpack their things, and just kind of go about their day. However, as soon as they walk inside, something right off the bat catches their eye. An empty wine bottle on the kitchen countertop. Lauri never drank. Carl said that in the last 10 years, he hadn't seen Lauri drink a glass of wine. This stood out a lot. Carl set down his bags and he started to take a look around the house, but nothing besides the bottle of wine really stood out of place. Lauri's purse wasn't there, but again, that could be explained by her being out running errands or just like being out and about. Carl tried to kind of reason with himself as to why the bottle of wine was on the counter, but he started to think, maybe Lauri had a friend over on the weekend and the friend drank the wine and that's why it's there. They continue looking around and Carl walks over to the answering machine to see if there were any messages. Maybe Lauri had called the house to let them know that she would be back later, but no. The only messages that were on the answering machine were actually from Carl himself, who had called earlier to let Lauri know when he was boarding the plane, when he was landing, and to also inform her that he was on his way back home. However, these voicemails were unread. Lauri hadn't heard them yet, so since he was home, Carl decided to just delete them. He continued looking around the house, but there was no note from Lauri stating that she left or was going out or anything like that. Still, at this point, no red flags have gone off, which I feel like is kind of natural. I don't think right away you would assume that something bad had happened or call the police or anything like that. I think that's exactly what was going on in Carl's mind. He just truly believed that his wife was out running errands. After clearing the answering machine, Carl goes upstairs, and this is when something else catches his eye. The bed wasn't made, and Lauri's nightgown was on the floor in the closet. Lauri and Carl had the habit of always making the bed as soon as they got up in the morning, and Lauri always hung up her nightgown on a hanger. But again, maybe she was in a rush to go somewhere, so again, Carl didn't think much of it. It wasn't until he noticed some fibers and the tip of a rubber glove lying between the unmade bed sheets that made him stop to question things. He picked up the items and he placed them on the bathroom counter to take a closer look at later. He even put the little tip of the glove on his finger and thought, what is this doing in our bed? Not only did he see those items in the bed sheets, but he also saw some blood stains. Initially, he thought it was just like menstrual blood, but then he noticed that both sides of the bed had the blood stains, which was unusual. He then also saw Lauri's wedding rings and just like other rings, which was odd because she never left without them. Now, I know, hearing all of this sounds very odd. I'm sure you're thinking, how did Carl not question this or call the police as soon as he found the blood? Well, it's because he truly thought that Lauri was just out running errands and just didn't think that something bad had happened to his wife. I feel like no one wants to think that something sinister could happen to their loved one, so I think in his mind he kind of just froze a little bit and didn't want to kind of accept the fact that things weren't okay. Some time passed and Carl thought that he would just kind of drive around to spots he knew Lauri could be at, like the local church or the Chamber of Commerce, to see if he could spot her van parked outside, since the night before Lauri had attended a dinner at the Chamber of Commerce, so Carl thought that maybe she went back to help clean up, but he drove around and he didn't see any sign of Lauri or her van whatsoever. Lauri did drive a very distinguishable car. She drove a 1998 Plymouth Voyager, which was like a purple/burgundy colored van. So it's not like her van blended in with everyone else. It was something very noticeable. So the fact that Carl didn't spot her van anywhere was really odd. Carl decides to reach out to their neighbors, the Pierces, who they are very close to. In fact, the Pierces were actually Rochelle's godparents, so yeah, they knew each other very well. Carl calls them to see if maybe they know anything about Lauri's whereabouts, but they don't know anything. So now Carl is getting worried and he decides to call the police at around 8 or 9 p.m. to tell them that something felt wrong, that his wife is usually very communicative and that she hasn't been in touch with him all day. Around 45 minutes or so later, Alaska State Trooper Bob Klaus called Carl to ask him some questions to begin the investigation. Trooper Klaus and Carl were actually friends, of course, since the town was extremely small and everyone knew everyone, so they were really close with each other. but they were also close because Rochelle and Trooper Klaus's daughters were friends, and because Jeffrey had dated his older daughter at one point, so the families just knew each other really well. So when Trooper Klaus got the call from Carl that night, he feared that a sinister scene he saw earlier that day could be related to Lauri's disappearance. Earlier that Sunday morning, Trooper Klaus got a call from a hunter named Scott who stumbled upon a smoldering van. The van was in an isolated area and it appeared to be empty. However, when Scott got a closer look at the burnt van, he saw a human body that was so badly burnt, nearly to ashes and beyond recognition. Scott was in shock and he called his mom, who works in emergency services, and then she called the Alaska State Troopers, one of them being Bob Klaus. Scott took them to where he saw the van, and when Trooper Klaus approached the van, he just had such a bad feeling. The spot smelled like gasoline and it was in the middle of nowhere. The body also wasn't in the driver's seat. It looked like someone set the car on fire with this person in the back seat. To them, this looked like a murder. Since the van and the body were so badly burned, they had no way of identifying the body. This was all just very suspicious, especially since stuff like this didn't really happen in their small town. It was just a place where, yeah, crime occurred, but nothing like this. Sergeant Randy McFerrin from the Alaska State Bureau of Investigation was called in, and he took charge of this investigation, and he actually called in for backup, but the backup investigators wouldn't arrive till the next day, Monday morning. So again, just to summarize, Sunday morning, a badly burned body was found in a van, and then that Sunday evening, police received a call from Carl informing them that his wife and her van were missing. So now that Trooper Klaus is informed about this, he started to kind of make the connection. He was like, well, what are the odds that this morning I found a body burnt in a van and Lauri and her van are missing? Again, since there was still no official ID of the body or of the van, Trooper Klaus couldn't tell Carl anything about his suspicions yet that night when he spoke to him, but again, knew that this was most likely Lauri's body that they had found earlier. No one else was reported missing, so it had to be Lauri. Trooper Klaus was thinking to himself, who would want to kill Lauri? I mean, he knew that the whole town loved her, that she was a pillar of the community, so he just didn't understand why someone would do this. Trooper Klaus did tell Sergeant McFerrin about the rumors of Carl having an affair and possibly having a motive to do this to his wife, but Carl had a solid alibi. He was in Juneau, there was confirmation that he was there was like flight confirmation, so he was out of town when this happened, but that didn't mean he couldn't have hired someone else to do this for him. So with this, Carl was now their #1 suspect. The following morning on Monday, Carl missed work so he could stay at home and speak with investigators, and Rochelle went to school. Back at the spot where the burning van and the body were found, forensics took the body, placed it in a body bag, and then took it to the state medical examiner's office, and the van was towed away. Investigators did find the VIN before it was towed away, and it was confirmed through the DMV that the van belonged to Lauri Waterman. There was gasoline all over the body and the car, and the body was basically just bones at this point. And again, since it was so badly burnt, dental records would be required to identify the body, but again, it was most likely Lauri. Craig Police Chief James C. was getting his morning coffee at the local coffee shop where everyone hung out and kind of started their mornings when he heard people talking about a smoldering van being discovered. Of course, in their small town, this news spread like wildfire. James heard this and was like, what is going on? Now, Chief James also knew Carl and Lauri. He was not as close to them as Trooper Klaus was, but again, they were friendly acquaintances since, again, they lived in such a small town and the two were deeply involved in the community's day-to-day events, so this was just a shocker to him. Chief James wasn't working that Sunday when all of this first happened, so he was just now learning about all of this, about Lauri being missing, about a van being found, about a burnt body being found. This was just a lot. At around 2 p.m. on Monday, Chief James got confirmation that the van was in fact Lauri's, and he was going to tell Carl himself. On his way over to the Waterman house, James asked Don Pierce, their good neighbor and again Rochelle's godparent, to be with him to show Carl support while he delivered this very difficult news to him, and he actually asked if he could go pick up Rochelle from school to take her home. Don says that he showed up to her school and told her that they needed to go home right away. Rochelle told him, I can't, I've called Jason. Now, Jason was one of Rochelle's older friends. His full name is Jason Allen Arant, and he was 24 years old. which is odd because Rochelle is 16, so why is a 24-year-old hanging out with a young teen? Anyway, so as soon as Rochelle tells Dawn, like, I can't go home right now, like, I've already called Jason to come here, Jason shows up at the school. He walked over to Rochelle, gave her a hug, and told her that everything was going to be okay. They started holding hands, he was trying to comfort her, and he even turned to Dawn and was like, hello, she needs comfort right now, like, what are you doing? And Dawn replied with, yeah, I know, that's what I'm trying to do, and he grabbed his goddaughter and took her home. This interaction was just like really weird. Like, Dawn was like, who is this Jason guy? Like, why is this older guy coming to your school to hug you? Like, this is not the time to be doing this. So anyways, they go home, and when they finally get to the Waterman home, Dawn dropped Rochelle off, and then he went to go park his car next door. That way there would be room in the driveway for investigators to park. As Dawn was walking back to the Waterman home, and as Chief James was finally pulling up, because again, they were there to inform Carl about this devastating news, a third person also pulled up to the Waterman home. It was Jason. Jason looks like he is also going to approach the front door, and he tells Chief James and Dawn that he's just there to comfort Rochelle during this difficult time, but Chief James stops him and is just like, no, like, you don't need to be here right now, like, go back in your car. And Jason listens to him. After this, Chief James and Dawn go inside the Waterman home, and Rochelle is in the living room, so James tells Carl that they need to go speak in private, and they go into like this little home office room of the house where James finally tells him about what's going on. He says that although the van is in fact Lauri's, it hasn't been confirmed the body found inside the van is Lauri, but that it most likely was. Carl's heart just absolutely broke. I mean, that was just the worst news he could hear. You know, at this point, Lauri had been missing since Sunday morning, so he knew that things weren't right, but to hear that Lauri's van was found on fire and that her body was possibly in there, it was just the most gut-wrenching news he could ever hear. As soon as Chief James told him that, Carl was like, listen, I need to show you something important. So he takes James upstairs, and that's when he shows him the bloody sheets, the fibers he found, and the rubber glove tip that he saw when he got home the day before. And this is when James is like, okay, this is a crime scene, like, we need to search this house ASAP. To everyone, this was looking more and more like foul play, so James told Carl that he and Rochelle needed to pack their bag and that they needed to stay away for a couple of days while forensics searched the house. And that's what they did. They quickly got their things, and Carl and Rochelle went over to stay at the Pierce's home while the Waterman home was locked down. Chief James knew that they had to identify the body using dental records, so he sent one of his guys to go get Lauri's x-rays as quickly as possible. It was all just, again, so shocking that this was happening in their small town. The initial prime suspect was Carl, like I mentioned earlier, but since he had a solid alibi, it was thought that perhaps he hired someone to kill Lauri while he was away. But after investigators took their time to like thoroughly look at his phone and like kind of just check everything, they concluded that Carl had nothing to do with this, and then he was completely cleared. On top of that, he also denied ever having an affair. So now that Carl was cleared, police went back to the drawing board and were like, okay, if Carl didn't do this, then who did? They started going through Lauri's things, and that's when they found an event pamphlet from a reunion that Lauri attended back in the summer. And on this event pamphlet was a list of names. So police were like, okay, maybe someone she saw at this reunion had a reason to go after her or something like that. I mean, at this point, investigators really didn't have a solid lead. It was so unlikely someone would want to hurt Lauri, yet alone murder her. So in their minds, they're like, yeah, maybe someone from this reunion did this to Lauri. Going back to IDing Lauri's body, a forensic odontologist confirmed that the body was Lauri's through her x-rays, and the Alaska State Chief Medical Examiner, Frank, testified that only 33 pounds remained of her charred remains, and it was determined that she died from blunt force trauma. It was now officially confirmed that this body was Lauri Waterman. It was just huge news. Everyone was wondering, like, what happened to her, who did this to her, and why? Yes, there was that list of names from the reunion that Lauri attended back in the summer, and yes, they had to look into Lauri's friends, but Trooper Klaus didn't believe that Lauri's friends did this to her or that someone from the reunion did this to her. He just knew that this wasn't the direction that they should be going in. He knew the Waterman family very well. Like I said, his daughters were friends with Rochelle, and his oldest dated Rochelle's brother. So with them being that close to each other, he knew about some friction that had been going on in the family fairly recently, and believed that this friction could have something to do with Lauri's death. It turns out that Lauri and Carl were struggling with Rochelle because she had recently changed. She began wearing all black clothing, and she began painting her nails black and wearing makeup, which of course isn't bad in itself. There is nothing wrong with dressing in all black, but what really concerned the family was the fact that Rochelle Rochelle began dabbling into Wiccan practices. Now, Wicca is described as the largest modern pagan or neo-pagan religions. Its followers, who are called Wiccans, typically identify as witches and drew inspiration largely from the pre-Christian religions of Europe. Since Lauri was traditional Catholic, she was not in agreement with Rochelle doing this. She did try to guide Rochelle away from it, and according to Carl, it was something that Lauri was very uncomfortable with, but there was never like any intense arguments between them or like any ultimatums regarding it. It was more of Lauri just telling her daughter like, hey, I'm not really a big fan of you doing this stuff. I would really appreciate it if you could stop. Rochelle at this point was also hanging out with people that her parents didn't agree with, so they told her to not go out, and then because of that, they caught her sneaking out a couple of times in the middle of the night. So it just seemed like Rochelle was kind of in that like rebellious teenage phase. However, the main cause of friction that Trooper Klaus believed to be straining the family was that Rochelle was dating an older guy who Lauri and Carl did not approve of. The same guy that Chief James saw earlier at the Waterman home. Yes, this was 24-year-old Jason. Jason was a janitor at a high school and a Marine Corps dropout, living in his mother's basement, spending his days playing video games, playing Dungeons and Dragons, smoking, drinking, and hanging out with Rochelle, who was 16 at the time. He and Rochelle also hung out a lot with Jason's best friend, 24-year-old Brian James Riddell. Brian was homeschooled up until high school, but met Jason at a Bible camp many years ago when they were around 16 years old. And from there, the two became blood brothers. And I'm not just saying blood brothers as in like they were very close. I mean actually blood brothers. Now, blood brothers is basically when each person makes a small cut, usually on the finger or palm of the hand, and then the two people press the finger or the hands together, allowing each other's blood to flow into one another. It's like kind of like a pledge of loyalty to each other. So they saw each other as blood brothers, and Brian didn't really have a good childhood. He had physically abusive parents. His parents were very distant, so he took pride in being a good friend and being there for the people close to him. So these two men were hanging out with a 16-year-old girl. This is not normal. Even worse, Rochelle and Brian actually dated at one point as well. Yes, this is literally Jason's best friend, and Jason is dating Rochelle, but yet at one point Brian was also dating Rochelle. The two met through Ian, which is Rochelle's ex-boyfriend, while they were all playing a game called Dungeons and Dragons with each other and like other teenagers. Brian had a computer repair shop called Dark Wolf, and Rochelle worked there over the summer, and there they became super close and they began dating. Rochelle was 15 when they dated, and they did have sex. The two called it off shortly after an argument they had, and after that, Brian thought that his blood brother should also date Rochelle. After all, they were blood brothers, and what was his was also Jason's. He thought if he didn't have a chance with Rochelle anymore, then maybe Jason would. So Rochelle began dating Jason, and they also had sex. This time when Rochelle was 16 years old. So that's kind of a little bit of a backstory on them. The fact that Brian saw Rochelle as something to share with his friend is very disturbing. I mean, just the fact that these grown men were hanging out with a teenager is disturbing in itself. It's just really gross. Now, I will say that the age of consent in Alaska at the time was 16 years old, but still, like, of course, just because it's like legally allowed, it doesn't mean that it's okay, and also doesn't mean that Rochelle's parents were like jumping up and down being like, yay, this is so great, I love your boyfriend. Of course not. Rochelle's parents found this to be extremely wrong. Lauri was very vocal about her disapproval of the relationship and the fact that she was hanging out with these two older guys, but that didn't stop Rochelle. As for how Carl felt about this relationship, he wasn't a fan either. Jason was a janitor at a school, and while Carl said that there's nothing wrong with being a janitor, it just didn't seem like Jason had any desire to advance in his life or get like a different job. So they just kind of felt like if Rochelle continued to spend more time with him, then she also wouldn't reach her full potential and Jason would kind of hold her back. Rochelle's change in appearance, her interest in Wicca, and the fact that she was dating and hanging out with these older men was just like very out of character for Rochelle in the eyes of her parents. Rochelle was an honor student. She was very involved in extracurricular activities such as volleyball, basketball, softball, academic decathlon, honor choir, band, the Parent-Student Teacher Association, and student council. She was like the perfect student, and it seemed like Rochelle was a great daughter with big plans for her future. That was the image that she gave off to her parents. However, online, she portrayed a different image. She had this personal blog titled My Crappy Life, and there, Rochelle portrayed herself herself as a very unhappy girl stuck in a miserable town with her miserable parents and just being overall miserable. This was a completely different image than what the small community of Craig had of the Waterman family. She would write things in this blog painting her family in a different light, such as, quote, "Well, I'm grounded. Last night my mom went psycho bitch me and cast me out. So I went to crash at someone's house, then she freaked. We for loving parental units. I even got to fly down the stairs." And then in another post she wrote, quote, "I live in the suckiest place on earth, a shithole in Alaska. Don't you hate it when the little pieces of shit pile up to the point you're at the breaking point and you want to scream and cry at the same time? I don't know whether to kill somebody, myself, or just curl up into a fetal position under my covers and lay there for a couple of days. Either way, I'm not good." Now, that is such an eerie and just like dark post to make. She was literally saying that she doesn't know whether she should kill somebody or kill herself. There was also some posts from Rochelle saying that her mom fat shamed her and withheld food from her. She wrote, quote, "My mom finally gave me back the right to eat, but wants to send me to fat camp this summer. I think it's rather hilarious. I mean, I agree, I'm chunky, but if she sends me off, I'll be the skinny girl and get sat upon. That part wouldn't be funny, but overall, it's quite amusing. Silly mother." Now, some of her posts could be kind of passed off as like a simple teenager ranting, but others are way deeper. So that's a little bit of a backstory of what was going on between Lauri and her daughter Rochelle at the time of Lauri's death. There was definitely a lot of tension between them, and when police were actually looking through the Waterman house, they ended up finding a letter that Lauri had written to her daughter Rochelle. In this letter, Lauri was in a way apologizing to Rochelle for their strained relationship and explained how she wanted to have a better relationship with her and that she loved her. According to Lorraine Pierce, their neighbor and Lauri's best friend and Rochelle's godparent, she said that Lauri explained to her how sad and worried she was about how the relationship was with Rochelle, that she was worried Rochelle was depressed and that she only wanted the best for her. So with people knowing about the problems going on between Lauri and Rochelle, and with this letter that Lauri had written, Trooper Klaus started to believe that maybe Rochelle was involved in Lauri's murder. He knew that this friction between Lauri and Rochelle was mainly because of Rochelle's relationship with Jason. This could be their lead. A 24-year-old man dating a 16-year-old girl whose parents don't approve of their relationship could have plenty of reasons to kill Lauri. But was it just Jason that could have motive to kill Lauri, or could Rochelle also have a motive? Let's take a step back though, and let's talk about how Rochelle was doing the day after her mom went missing. Monday morning, while Rochelle was at school and before police even confirmed the VIN of the van and way before forensics even confirmed the body was Lauri, Rochelle was saying some very strange things at school in kind of like a nonchalant manner. According to her gym teacher Shane, when he heard the news about Lauri being missing, he went up to Rochelle in school concerned and asked her if she was okay. He says that Rochelle looked at him and casually said, "My mom probably got drunk and ran off the road someplace." She said that she assumed this because her and her dad saw an empty wine bottle at the house when they got home. Now, no one knew what had happened yet. Again, at this point, the van wasn't identified as Lauri's nor her body, but Rochelle was going around saying that her mom got into a drunk driving accident. And again, was just saying it very casually. It was just very odd. Like Shane was like, well, that's like a really weird thing to say, but like maybe Rochelle's just like going through her own thing right now. Maybe she doesn't know how to cope with the disappearance of her mom and she's just kind of like saying random things. I mean, you would sort of expect a teenage girl with a missing mother to be a little bit more concerned or like sad, but Rochelle was pretty much acting unfazed. Something that also stuck out was a post that Rochelle made on her blog. She wrote, quote, "Just to let everyone know, my mother was murdered. I won't have computer access until a weekend or so because the police took my computer to go through the hard drive. I thank everyone for their thoughts and emails. I hope to talk to you when I get my computer back." So that was Rochelle's behavior while her mom was missing, and then after she found out that her mom was dead, everyone just found her behavior to be extremely odd. Now, going back to the investigation, police were now focusing their attention on Jason and his friend Brian. Investigators immediately brought them in for questioning, and they both denied having any knowledge or involvement in Lauri's death. When Brian was first interviewed, officers noticed that he had shaved off all his hair, which raised suspicion. Jason told investigators that the person they should be looking into is Rochelle's ex-boyfriend Ian. Why? Well, apparently when the two broke up, Ian made some weird comments, but that was just something that Jason made up. He was just kind of saying random things to kind of divert investigators' attention elsewhere. He also told investigators that the night before Lauri disappeared, he and Brian were together at Brian's home drinking, playing video games, and watching the movie The Princess Bride on repeat. That the next day he was home and that he had nothing to do with this whole thing whatsoever. A few days after being questioned, Jason says that he was attacked. He was attacked by a masked man who threatened him to stay away from Rochelle or there would be another accident. He called the police, and when authorities arrived, Jason had a scratch on his neck, claiming that a man grabbed him by the hair and then put a knife his throat. But to authorities, this scratch looked self-inflicted and the whole story just seemed really fishy and they were not buying it whatsoever. Jason claimed that this attack happened when he was alone, so there was no one else there to witness it, and everyone just felt like this was too much of a coincidence that this happened right after he was questioned and no one saw it. I think he did this to make it seem as if this attacker was the one who killed Lauri and was now threatening him. He really thought that this would make him seem innocent and that police would just buy this story. Anyways, the following day, Jason is brought back in for questioning, and this is when he finally began to crack. He began saying that although he had nothing to do with this directly, he did know who killed Lauri. He claimed that Brian, his best friend, who also dated Rochelle in the past, killed Lauri, and that he only helped dispose of the body. Police were like, okay, well, if you're telling the truth, put on a wire and get Brian to confess. Jason was like, okay, fine, I'll do it. So he puts on the wire and then he goes to secretly meet up with Brian to secretly record him. However, this didn't turn out the way that Jason had hoped. Instead of Brian incriminating himself, he made certain comments during the recorded conversation implicating Jason in the murder as well. So Jason was telling the police that Brian did it, but Brian is saying that Jason did it. Their stories just weren't matching up, and regardless of that, police just knew that both of them had to be involved. During this time, when police were trying to kind of gather all the evidence, police caught Brian attempting to get rid of evidence. They discovered that he had burned the soles of his shoes out of fear of investigators finding his footprints near the crime scene. With this, they decided to arrest the pair, and Brian was the first to be arrested. The following day, Jason was arrested, and both of them confessed to kidnapping and murder Lauri. But why did they do this? Well, it seems like they both had their reasons. Rochelle began confiding in Jason about the alleged physical abuse she was enduring at the hands of her mom. She would also tell her friends about this abuse, claiming that her mom would push her down the stairs, that her mom would grab her aggressively, that she would withhold food from her, that she would constantly ground her, especially if she came back with low grades, that at one time her mom threatened her with a knife, and that she also hit her with a baseball bat. Rochelle would sometimes even show up with bruises, which is why Jason believed her right away, but Carl said that Rochelle bruised easily from all the physical sports that she played and because of how active she was. Now, we don't know if this abuse actually happened though. Of course, none of us were there. Everyone who knew Lauri testified during the trial that this was not likely whatsoever, that they never saw Lauri as being a violent or aggressive person, that their relationship was normal. Yes, there were arguments, but they also had a lot of really good times together and were just normal apart from those arguments. Rochelle's friends also testified during the trial, saying that they truly didn't believe what Rochelle would tell them and that they thought she was exaggerating her stories. To the whole town of Craig, Lauri was literally a saint, and to investigators, it was basically Rochelle's word against everyone else. I mean, of course, you never want to doubt someone's claims of being abused because that is something that should be taken very seriously. And of course, abuse isn't always well known. Abuse can be silent and it doesn't always leave bruises or happen in front of other people. But we really aren't 100% sure if there was actually any abuse going on. But like I said, a lot of people just truly believe that it didn't happen and that Rochelle was exaggerating and lying. So anyways, Rochelle started to tell Jason about how she was getting abused by her mom, and back in August, the talk of getting rid of Lauri began between Jason and Rochelle. Getting rid of Lauri would protect Rochelle from the abuse, and not only that, but it would also allow Jason to be with Rochelle with no backlash or restrictions from her mother. This would even give them the possibility of running away together and starting a new life. It was the perfect plan in Jason's eyes. So he decides to reach out to his blood brother Brian for help in committing this crime. Jason told Brian that Rochelle desperately needed their help since she was being abused, and Brian, having been abused as a child, wanted to protect Rochelle from going through the same things. He wanted to protect her, to save her from this horror. Although he wanted to save her, Brian said he initially didn't really think that they were going to murder Lauri. He was like, I thought we were just like kind of talking and like playing pretend, but then Jason just kept telling him like, no, if we don't save Rochelle and then something happens to her and she gets hurt or even worse, we're going to be held responsible and we're going to blame ourselves forever. This is when Brian started to realize that they were being serious, and again, since they're blood brothers, Brian decided to help.
I asked him if he was ready to do anything to help Rochelle, because I knew at that point that he had feelings for her too.
And what was his response?
He said absolutely.
Okay. And then what?
And then we started to.
Well, did you tell him what you wanted him to do?
Well, yes.
Okay. And what was that?
I told him that Rochelle wanted her mother dead.
Okay. And so what was his response?
He said, okay, let's do it.
Now, we'll get into exactly what happened the night that Lauri was murdered when we get to the trial part, because they went into very specific details about what they did that night. It is honestly very, very brutal. Now, that's basically why Jason and Brian decided to do this. Brian was under pressure to protect Rochelle, and Jason wanted a relationship with Rochelle free of backlash from her parents. After his arrest, Jason's computer was seized because, of course, police wanted to dig deep into it and see if they could find any more evidence, and on his computer there were new of Rochelle on it. It's just really, really sick thinking that this 24-year-old man had these images of a 16-year-old girl, regardless if she sent them herself or if he took them or whatever. It's just very, very disturbing. Now, it wasn't only Jason and Brian who were questioned. Rochelle was also brought in for questioning. During her first interview, the day after Lauri was reported missing, Rochelle described her relationship with her mother as generally good, except for, of course, like little minor disagreements here and there, but again, her blog would say otherwise. She also lied to police during this interview and said that she was only friends with Jason and nothing more. She said as far as she knew, her mom didn't have any enemies. The only person that she could think of was this cable guy that Lauri had a disagreement with once before, but said that her mom was very well liked by everyone in the community, so she couldn't think of who would want to hurt her mother. In a second interview that was conducted, Rochelle agreed to visit the police station for questioning and initially maintained that her relationship with her mother was fine. However, as the interview progressed, she claimed that Lauri was physically abusive towards her. Rochelle recalled incidents where Lauri allegedly hit her with a baseball bat on her legs, threatened to force her into prostitution, and once even came at her with a knife and pushed her down the stairs. The knife incident apparently happened while Lauri was cutting up meat for dinner and came at her with a knife in her hand because she found out that her and her ex-boyfriend were having sex. So what she told investigators during this interview is basically what she's already told Jason and to her friends at school. She did tell investigators that she had confided in Jason and Brian about the alleged abuse and that they would encourage her to defend herself anytime that this happened, but she said that she never did because she was a coward. She also said Jason even wanted to talk to Lauri himself at one point to figure out what was going on and to try to stop the abuse. So all of that was said during Rochelle's second interview, and then finally during Rochelle's third interview on Friday, Rochelle admitted that she might have exaggerated her claims of abuse. Now, during this third interview, police kind of already knew what was going on. I mean, at this point, they had already spoken to Jason and Brian, so they knew about the plan that they had made to get rid of Lauri. Rochelle said that she wasn't aware of any true murder plan. However, police ended up finding some letters and emails between her and Jason that showed that they were making plans for a future together after Lauri's death. Now, I'll explain more about what these communications and these emails said because they were truly frightening. In the end, after this third interrogation, Rochelle was also arrested. She was charged with conspiracy to commit murder, first-degree murder, second-degree murder, kidnapping, burglary, vehicle theft, and tampering with evidence. So what exactly happened? Well, let's talk about what was revealed during the trial. So first, let's talk about Brian's perspective. He testified that, again, Jason was the one that came to him and was like, listen, we gotta save Rochelle. She's being abused. If you're really my blood brother, then you'll help help me get rid of Lauri. Brian said that during this time he was not in direct communication with Rochelle, so everything that he was being told about the abuse and about what was going on was only based on what Jason was telling him. So he had no idea if Rochelle was actually being abused or if maybe Jason was like over exaggerating what Rochelle was telling him. But Jason is his close friend. I mean, he's someone that he sees as a brother, so he trusted Jason's word. Now, while Jason is telling Brian that Rochelle is getting abused, that they need to save her, and that time is basically running out, Rochelle is literally telling Jason, like, no, I kind of feel weird about the plan. Me and my mom are getting along better. Like, I don't think we should go through with this. Now, yes, she wasn't directly telling Jason to stop with the plan, but she also wasn't telling him repeatedly, like, hey, I'm in danger, you need to save me. So it seems like Rochelle was having doubts about this and like didn't want to go through with it, but Jason already had it in his head, like, no, I need to save my girlfriend, and also the only way I can truly be with her is if her mom is dead. So over the months between August and November, the three of them concocted various plans to free Rochelle. Jason also mentioned wanting to kill dad Carl and her ex-boyfriend Ian, since he viewed them as possible obstacles, since Carl of course could still impose restrictions on the relationship, and because Ian was Rochelle's ex-boyfriend and he could also kind of be a threat to their relationship. So he was like, I think we should also kill them too, but everyone else was like, no, I think our main focus should be on Lauri. Again, Rochelle and Brian weren't like speaking directly about this, but Jason would tell Rochelle what he and Brian were planning on doing. So one of Jason and Brian's ideas to get rid of Lauri was first by dumping her body in cement and then dumping her in the ocean. Another being a shooting, blackmailing and threatening her to leave Rochelle alone, tampering with her car brakes, and even using explosives. The day that they were supposed to do the shooting, it actually didn't go through because Brian forgot a bolt to his rifle, and after failed attempts from all of their other plans, they ultimately decided on getting rid of Lauri by kidnapping her, placing her body in the van, taking it out to a remote location, and then breaking her neck, making it look like she died in a drunk driving accident.
The idea was to abduct her from the house, and we'd already kind of chosen a spot out on the highway that looked like it might be a place where something like that could feasibly occur. And then the van with Lauri Waterman in it would be taken out there. Her neck would be broken, trying to make it consistent with an automobile accident. And then the vehicle would be pushed over the embankment.
So they decided that the weekend Rochelle was going to be away at her volleyball tournament and Carl was going to be away as well would be the perfect weekend for all of this to go down. On the night of November 13th, 2004, Lauri was at a Chamber of Commerce banquet dinner. She was socializing with everyone. She even won a fleece jacket in the raffle, and she was just having a great time. She stayed late to help clean up, and then she left at around 10 p.m. The next day, on Sunday, she planned on going to church in the morning and then was going to get the house ready to welcome home Carl and Rochelle since they were away all weekend. Lauri went home that Saturday night completely unaware that hours later her life would end. While she was at the banquet dinner, Jason and Brian were getting everything ready. They gathered their supplies, which included duct tape, towels, a 5-gallon jug of gasoline, latex gloves, flashlights, and a dirty and greasy rope that Brian found on the side of the road. They got all of their supplies ready, and then they waited to make sure Lauri would be back at home sleeping, ready to catch her off guard. While they waited, Brian shaved off all his hair, he shaved his face, and basically his entire body because he didn't want to risk leaving any of his hair behind, which then could link him back to the murder. At around midnight, Jason and Brian loaded up Jason's truck and they headed over to Lauri's home. Brian was the one who would be going inside to kidnap Lauri and then would go meet Jason after. So Brian gets out, he takes some tools thinking that he may have to break his way into the house, and then he approaches the home. He broke in through a garage window, left a footprint behind, and then entered the garage door leading to the house by sticking his arm through the pet door and reaching to unlock the door from the inside. Once inside, he went up to Lauri's bedroom, and as he was going to open her bedroom door, he could hear that Lauri was moving around inside. She possibly heard a noise, and she got up and shut her bedroom door, which startled Brian and made him quickly run to another room to hide. At this point, Brian thought that he was caught, that Lauri had heard him, that's why she shut the door, and that she called the police, and he was honestly just hiding in that room expecting to hear sirens at any second. But after waiting for some time and not hearing Lauri move again and not hearing police arrive, Brian figured that Lauri did not call the police and that the plan could continue forward. Brian entered Lauri's bedroom and rushed up to her bedside where Lauri was lying face down. Brian put a rag over her head and Lauri woke up crying, and Brian began to gag her with a towel. Brian then placed his elbow on the middle of her back to kind of hold her down, and then he tied her hands and feet together, placing towels between Lauri's skin and the duct tape to not leave any adhesive marks on her skin, since again they had to make this look like it was a drunk driving accident, not an abduction. While he was doing all of this, Lauri was crying and was extremely frightened, but probably wasn't really able to defend herself since Brian is a pretty big guy. He was 6'5" and he weighed around 277 pounds, which I mean, if someone is like lying on you and like putting all of their weight on you, 277 pounds is incredibly hard to get off of you. So Lauri was crying and she did her best to fight him off, but it just didn't work. At some point during this, when he was trying to like tie her up with the rope did leave behind some fibers, and then the tip of Brian's rubber glove ripped off.
So when you opened the door, did you open the door rapidly?
Yes.
And then how rapidly did you go into the room?
Didn't run, but I rushed.
Okay.
Went up to the side of the bed, put a rag over Lauri's head to gag her.
When she was lying on the bed, was she lying on her back, stomach?
Face down.
Face down on her stomach, okay. So when you put the cloth over her head, what happened then?
She woke up. I placed my elbow in the middle of her back so she couldn't move. She started to cry.
Okay. Did she say anything?
No. Well, there was a gag over her mouth, so.
Okay.
Brian then forced Lauri to change out of her nightgown and into normal clothing. Then he took her downstairs to the kitchen and forced her to drink a partially empty wine bottle. This bottle was already in the home, so Brian didn't need to take out the one that he brought with him. Then, after she drank the bottle of wine, Brian placed Lauri in the back of her own van and then drove off in it to go meet Jason at their meeting point, which was in a remote area about an hour north. Now, while Brian is doing all of this, Jason is at their meeting spot, and at this point, it's been 3 hours since he dropped Brian off at the house. So he was starting to get concerned, like he was thinking maybe Brian got caught, maybe something happened. So he starts driving back to the Waterman home, and as he's literally driving to the Waterman home, he passes Brian, who is driving Lauri's van, and they kind of signal to each other like, hey, the plan is all good, and Jason does a U-turn and starts following Brian back to their meeting point. At their meeting point, Brian placed a plastic trash bag on the ground to make sure Lauri didn't get the slightest bit dirty, again, since this had to look like an accident. Brian got Lauri out of the van, which at this point she was very, very drunk since she drank almost a whole bottle of wine, and she was someone who never really drank, so this definitely affected her more. Brian forced Lauri to get on her knees, and he was going to break her neck and kill her before placing the body back in the van. At this point during Brian's testimony, when Brian was describing trying to break Lauri's neck, they actually had to pause the testimony in the trial because Rochelle rushed out of the courtroom with her hand over her mouth, and then she went to go vomit outside. The judge was like, okay, pause, like let's kind of take a regroup. And when Rochelle came back, Brian continued describing this terrible, terrible thing he did. He said that he just couldn't break her neck. You know, he tried and he tried, but he just couldn't. While he was doing this, Lauri kept saying something to Brian. She kept repeating, can I ask you a question? Can I ask you a question? Can I ask you a question? But she wasn't saying anything else. She just kept asking them, can I ask you a question? Brian, of course, didn't care about what she was saying, so he just ignored her, and Jason then held Lauri down, and Brian tried to use a flashlight that they brought with them to smash her throat, but that didn't kill her either. Jason then crouched down near Lauri and said, you won't ever hurt Rochelle again. Again, because in his mind, he was doing all of this because he loved Rochelle and truly believed that he was saving her from her abusive mother. Time continued, and they started to get nervous that the sun was going to come up soon and that someone would be able to see them doing this. So since their other ideas weren't really working, Brian decided to place his hands over her mouth and nose and suffocate Lauri. Lauri was barely alive after this, and she kind of began moving around, which then made her get dirty, which is exactly exactly what Brian and Jason were trying to avoid. There was a lot of mud in that area because it had rained that day, so Lauri got dirty very fast. Now with this, their plan was ruined. This wouldn't look like an accident where she just drank a bottle of wine, drove, and then crashed and broke her neck, resulting in her death. With the dirt all over her body, it now looked like something else had happened. So with this, they had a new plan. And their new plan was to place Lauri in the van and then set her and the van on fire. Before they moved to their new location to go through with this plan, Lauri was gasping in the back of the van until she let out her last breath and died. After this, Brian and Jason drove her to the new location. They parked her van on an incline with the front of the car facing downhill, placed the keys in the ignition, rolled down all of the windows, placed Lauri's body in between the back seats, put the wine bottle that Brian and Jason took out but didn't use, placed it near her body, and then poured gasoline all over. Just as they were going to set it on fire, the van actually rolled down the hillside unexpectedly. So they tried making a gasoline trail that would set the van on fire, but that wasn't working since the ground was very wet and muddy from the weather. So then they grabbed a bunch of paper towels and lit those on fire and then threw them into the back of the van, which of course made all of it light on fire. They made sure it was all completely burned and then they simply left. They disposed of any evidence and tools that they used and then they drove back to Brian's house. That was that. In their minds, they finally saved Rochelle and now Jason could be with her without any restriction and they could just live happily ever after. What they did to Lauri is just absolutely horrifying. My heart breaks for what Lauri had to go through in her final hours before her death. It's just absolutely frightening, and I wonder what she was going to ask them when she kept saying, "Can I ask you a question?" I've seen some people speculate online that maybe she was going to ask them if Rochelle put them up to this, or maybe she was just going to ask them why they were doing this. It was also really hard watching them say this during the trial because they were just so casual about this testimony. They were like, yeah, I tried to like break her neck, or like, yeah, I tried to smash her throat with a flashlight, and they're just saying it so casually with like no emotion on their face. In the end, Brian and Jason pled guilty to first-degree murder, and Brian was sentenced to 99 years in prison. As for Jason, on the other hand, he was only sentenced to 50 years. A lot of people found this sentencing to be unfair since Jason was kind of like the mastermind behind this, and people felt like he kind of used Brian to commit the crime, but Brian was the one who actually committed the murder. As for Rochelle, her first trial began in 2006, and her defense was arguing that she was just like a vulnerable teenager who was manipulated by Jason, this much older man who wanted Rochelle all to himself and who twisted her words to justify murdering Lauri, and that he was the true mastermind behind this entire thing and just forced Brian to commit the crime. Her defense team also argued that Rochelle's confession during her interrogation was forced, that there was not enough evidence linking Rochelle to the murder, and that Jason was not a credible person, but a predator. The defense also had testimony from Dr. Marty Beyer, a clinical psychologist, to explain Rochelle's mindset during the events leading up to her mother Lauri's murder. She testified that when Rochelle talked to Jason about her frustrations with her mother, she was just like venting like a typical teenager and likely didn't understand the serious consequences her words could have, because teenagers use a different part of their brain than adults for decision making, for judgment, and for impulse control. So yeah, her defense was basically being like, listen, she's just a teenage girl who was venting to her boyfriend about her controlling mother, but she didn't actually mean it. She didn't actually want them to kill her mom. As for the prosecution though, they argued that Rochelle had more to do with the murder of her mother than she was claiming. They brought up things such as Rochelle agreeing to wipe down her home's handrails and doorknobs to cover up any evidence linking Jason and Brian to the crime after Lauri's murder. They also brought up a conversation that Rochelle had with Jason where she said that she was sad that the van was burned because that meant she would no longer be able to inherit it. They also presented emails between her and Jason talking about the murder and presented different testimonies suggesting she previously stated that she wanted her mother dead. As I mentioned earlier, those emails were very eerie, so let's go over them. In these communications, Jason referenced their life after Rochelle's mother goes away, saying, quote, "When this whole thing with your mother is over, and if it happens soon enough, we're talking a year absolute minimum here, I'm going to hire a team of the most expensive lawyers money can buy you to get you emancipated whether your mother is still here or not." which she shouldn't be. To the prosecution, those emails were incriminating. I mean, he was literally saying like, when your mother goes away and she's not going to be here any longer, I'm going to get you emancipated. So to them, they're like, that's obvious that Rochelle knew what was going on if Jason was literally emailing her about it. Now, even though Rochelle said that she didn't know of any actual plans to murder Lauri, there were also emails from Jason updating Rochelle about his and Brian's failed attempts to murdering Lauri, telling Rochelle things such as, oh yeah, and we canceled that hunting trip we were planning for today, but he said he'd like to go sometime soon, no later than a week from now if we can swing it, so that should be fun. Now, they were referring to murdering Lauri using the code phrase hunting trip. When Jason later mentioned this failed hunting trip, Rochelle said that she and her mother were getting along better and that they should call this off, yet Jason still continued mentioning ongoing plans to get rid of her. At one point in these emails, Rochelle also used the code word when talking to Jason. She said, quote, I'm tempted to take a hunting trip myself. Guess what my mom is wanting me to do by threatening me? Go out with Ian again, and I know why, because she figures when I'm with him, I won't smoke or drink because he won't allow it. Now, Rochelle was saying that she had second thoughts and that she attempted to call off the plan, yet the prosecution said, okay, well, if you really wanted to call off the plan, why didn't you call the police to notify them about this? Why didn't you warn your dad? Why didn't you warn your mom? Why didn't you tell anybody that these two people were planning on killing your mom? If you truly did not want this to go through, you should have told someone. The prosecution also explained how the week leading up to Rochelle being gone for her volleyball tournament and her dad being away, Jason had told her that that would be the perfect weekend to do it, referring to the murder. To this, Rochelle said, yeah, I suppose. So again, Rochelle is telling people that she wasn't aware of any specific plan for the murder and that she never really gave them the go-ahead to do it, yet there's proof that she knew her mom would be murdered that weekend. The prosecution was making Rochelle seem calculated in manipulating Jason and Brian to murder her mother for her and then distancing herself from the crime to avoid being incriminated as well. So how did Rochelle's trial end? Well, it ended in a mistrial because 10 jurors found Rochelle not guilty, but 2 believed that she was. So she was released on bail, and then in 2011, she was retried for the murder. This time, Rochelle was acquitted of 6 counts in her indictment, but was found guilty of criminally negligent homicide and was sentenced to 3 years in prison. However, I believe it wasn't like an additional 3 years to the time that she was in custody back in 2004, and because a third of her sentence would be taken off for good behavior, I believe she only had to serve another year. After Rochelle served her time, based on a post from her blog, it's believed that she moved to Florida and is basically just moving on with her life. Her blog is still active to this day, and a lot of her previous posts were removed. I'm not sure if she removed them herself or if the website just like removed the old ones, but they're gone. As I said, she's still active, and in January of 2023, she wrote, I hope you all have a great year. My life is wonderful, and I hope yours is too. Live naturally, socialize, and meet the love of your life. Your life will end up the best. Now, people have found this blog and they have written her comments basically being like, you're living your life, yet you like killed your mom, and like have written stuff about, you know, her trial. I'm not encouraging anyone to go to her blog and write to her or comment anything like that. I don't think that's a good idea, but people have done that. And to one of those comments, she replied, I went to court and paid my dues. You treat everyone as the unforgiven. I have been through the liberal court process. I am free to live my life now. I sleep fine actually without meds. I doubt you do. And then to another comment, she said, I'm actually the victim. You haven't seen a second of my life. People continued commenting things, telling her that she shouldn't be out, that she's a horrible person, that, you know, she was let off too easy. And in February of 2022, she wrote to them saying, well, you have all proven yourselves internet bullies of the Generation Z disorder. You don't know me, you don't know my story, and all you do is spew hate from your parents' basement. This is the world we are coming into, the woke, hate-filled, resentful bunch of losers. It'll take years before you realize that I am of a generation that doesn't give a fuck. Yes, I don't give a fuck about anything you throw at me. You end up broke and entitled after so many years, and I work my way to happiness as I have for so long. I work, I don't hate, and I succeed. I am happy, I am very happy. ponder on that. Now, those are just a few of the posts from Rochelle's blog. From what I've seen, many people believe that Rochelle should have served more time and that she was the true mastermind behind her mother's murder, that she manipulated Jason into carrying out the crime because she just didn't like her mother. It's not that her mom was actually abusing her, it was just like, oh, I don't like my mom, I want to get rid of her. On the other hand, other people believe that Rochelle was genuinely being abused and saw no other way to escape, and that Jason kind of just like used her desperation as a justification to kill Lauri. Then there are those who think that Rochelle wasn't really being abused at all and that Jason kind of twisted her words to carry out this murder so that he could have Rochelle all to himself. There's just a lot of different perspectives on this case about the role that each person played, and it's clear that the public opinion is very divided. I'm really curious to see what you guys think about this, about the role everyone played, about the trial, about the sentencing, about everything. So definitely leave me a comment down below with your thoughts. Now, as for what happened to the rest of the Waterman family after this terrible, terrible crime was committed, Carl, Lauri's father, went on to remarry and he relocated to New Mexico. However, he unfortunately passed away in 2015 after battling cancer. He loved Alaska so much and he requested that his ashes be scattered there. I'm not sure if Rochelle keeps up with her other family members or with her friends to this day. I do feel really sad for Carl and also for her brother Jeffrey. I mean, this is just so unfair. I mean, Jeffrey has lost both of his parents. His sister was convicted of a terrible crime. It's just really sad how so many lives were affected by this. It's truly heartbreaking to think about what Lauri went through. The thought of her last moments, the fear and the confusion she must have felt is just overwhelming. Waking up in the middle of the night to an intruder, being tied up in your own home, it's just a terrible nightmare. I do truly hope that she is resting peacefully. I mean, she just did not deserve this. I feel like this case really involves parents struggling to navigate their teens' defiance, of teens struggling with how to articulate emotions. This case also touches on grooming and predatory behavior. It's just a really complicated case, and like I said, I'm going to leave some resources down below for you guys to check it out. It's so important to know that there are people you can reach out to for help or sources that you can use to guide you if you're going through something similar. Rochelle was 15 years old and was sexually involved with two different adults. It's just frightening how Brian and Jason saw this as completely normal because it's not. It's just absolutely wrong no matter what. So like I said, I will also include some resources down below for grooming so you guys can be more aware of that. I find it shocking how many cases I've heard that are kind of similar to this, where, a teen starts dating someone that their parents don't approve of, and in the end, they decide to get rid of the parents because they believe that's the only way that they can truly be together. But I feel like most of the time it always ends up the same. Like you plan to kill your parents with your boyfriend and then the two of you are caught, you go to jail forever. I mean, it just feels like a repeating story that I've heard so many times, and I just truly think that murder is never the answer. I don't know, it's just really sad how common this is. But all right, you guys, that is pretty much everything I have for today's video. I would definitely, again, love to know your thoughts on this down below, and if there are ever any other cases that you would like me to cover, make sure to leave me a comment down below or submit it through my case suggestion form, which is in the description box down below. If you guys do not follow me on like Instagram and TikTok, I highly recommend that you guys go follow me because I always post like summaries of my cases over there, and I'm always active on TikTok and Instagram. So if you guys just kind of want to be more updated about what's going on, definitely go follow me on Instagram and TikTok. But yeah, I think that's pretty much all I have to say. Thank you guys so much for being here, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye, familia.